A winter storm erased the road, burying the mountains in silence, and in that cold white void, a wounded woman was left to disappear while a dying German shepherd refused to leave her side. A broke, exhausted veteran saw them in the storm and faced a choice that would change everything: drive past and stay safe, or stop and risk the last fragile piece he had left. This isn't a story about heroes or violence. It's about loyalty that bleeds, faith that whispers in the dark, and the quiet miracle that happens when someone refuses to walk away and no one is left behind. If you believe stories like this still matter, stay with us and don't forget to subscribe. The storm arrived without drama, only persistence, erasing the Montana mountains road layer by layer until distance, direction, and intention all blurred into white. Mike Carter had learned to read weather the way some men read faces. At 47, his body still remembered cold before his mind caught up to it. The ache in his left knee, a souvenir from an old fracture that never healed quite right, tightened as the temperature dropped. His hands, thick-knuckled and permanently scarred from decades of mechanical work, rested steady on the cracked steering wheel of his pickup. The truck was older than some of the men at the repair shop where he worked nights, its engine loud, its heater unreliable, but it was paid for, and that mattered. Mike lived by practical victories now. He had been discharged from the Army more than 20 years earlier, young enough then to believe leaving would also mean forgetting. It never worked that way. He didn't talk about his service, not because it was secret or heroic, but because it was heavy. The kind of heavy that sank deeper when spoken aloud. People at the shop knew him as quiet, dependable, the guy who covered extra shifts without complaint and never joined in the joking. He wasn't unfriendly. He just kept his distance, the way men did when they'd learned that attachments could be taken without warning. That night he was driving back to the small rented cabin he called home, tucked into a stand of pines off a barely maintained service road. The place wasn't much. One bedroom, thin walls, a wood stove that smoked more than it should. But it was cheap, isolated, and quiet. Quiet mattered. It gave his thoughts fewer places to echo. As he rounded a narrow bend, the headlights caught something that didn't belong. A weak flicker of light pulsed through the snowfall, irregular and wrong, followed by a smell that cut through the clean sharpness of winter. Burnt plastic, hot metal. Mike eased off the gas, instincts rising before explanation. There were no skid marks on the road, no signs of a slide. Instead, down the embankment, half buried in drifted snow, lay an SUV crumpled against rock and timber, its frame twisted as if struck from the side rather than thrown by ice. Mike pulled over and sat there longer than necessary, engine idling, wind rocking the truck. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He told himself help would come, that the mountains were full of people who drove too fast and learned the hard way. He told himself he was tired. Then he saw movement. A woman dragged herself from the open rear door of the SUV, her motions slow, deliberate, the way someone moved when every inch cost effort. She collapsed onto her side, leaving a dark smear on the snow. She was in her early 30s, slim but not fragile, with the kind of athletic build shaped by training rather than vanity. Her dark brown hair had come loose from whatever restraint once held it, strands frozen to blood along her temple and cheek. Her skin, olive-toned beneath grime and bruising, had gone pale with cold. Even injured, there was tension in her posture, a readiness that hadn't yet surrendered to pain. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, though Mike wouldn't learn it until later. What he noticed first were her eyes, dark, sharp, scanning the tree line even as her body shook. Fear lived there, yes, but not panic. This was a woman accustomed to danger, to thinking while hurt. Beside her, another shape shifted. A German shepherd lay partly across her legs, large even by the breed standards, his black and tan coat dulled by ash and snow. He was 6 years old, his muzzle beginning to gray just enough to hint at age, though his body was still powerful beneath injury. One hind leg was twisted unnaturally, and blood seeped through thick fur along his flank, already darkening in the cold. His chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm, breath rattling faintly. Still, when the woman moved, the dog forced his head up, amber eyes fixing on her with singular focus. The dog positioned himself between her and the open forest, despite the pain that made his muscles tremble. Mike felt something in his chest tighten, slow and familiar. He had seen that posture before, not in animals, but in men, the kind who placed themselves where danger would come first, not because they were ordered to, but because leaving wasn't an option they recognized. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching into knee-deep snow, the cold immediately biting through denim. The wind cut at his face, stubble stiff with ice. Up close, the damage to the vehicle told a clearer story. The metal wasn't bent from momentum alone. The impact was too localized, too violent. This hadn't been an accident. The woman tried to speak when she saw him, lips parting, but only a broken sound came out. Her hand moved weakly toward the dog's collar as if reassuring him by touch alone. The dog growled low in his chest, not in threat, but warning, his body tense even as it failed him. "It's okay," Mike said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. He kept his movements slow, visible. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dog's ears flicked, attention splitting between Mike and the woman. Loyalty anchored him. Mike knelt, ignoring the cold soaking through his jeans. He didn't rush. Years ago, someone had taught him that rushing only made mistakes faster. He checked the woman's breathing, shallow but present, then turned to the dog. The wound was bad, but not instantly fatal. Bleeding could be slowed, warmth could be given. Mike looked from them to the empty road, then back again. In another life, he might have called for help immediately, handed responsibility off. In this one, he hesitated. Something about the way the woman's eyes tracked the forest, the way the dog refused to turn away from her, told him this wasn't over just because the engine had stopped burning. "I've got a place not far," he said quietly, more to himself than them. "It's warm enough." The woman's eyes met his, assessing, weighing. She gave the smallest nod. Getting them into the truck was clumsy and slow. Mike lifted the woman carefully, mindful of her spine, her weight lighter than he expected, tension held in every muscle, even while fading in and out of consciousness. The dog protested when Mike tried to move him, a low sound vibrating through his chest, until Mike positioned him so the woman's hand could still rest against his neck. Only then did the dog allow it. As Mike drove away, the storm closed in behind them, swallowing the wreck until it vanished completely, as if it had never existed. The heater sputtered weakly, but it was better than nothing. Mike kept one eye on the road, the other on the rearview mirror where the dog's eyes watched him in reflection, unblinking. The woman murmured once, a wordless sound shaped by pain and cold. Mike felt the weight of the decision settle fully then. He had stopped. Whatever followed would belong to him now. When the cabin finally emerged from the snow, a dark shape against darker trees, Mike pulled in and cut the engine. The silence pressed close. He carried them inside one at a time, breath steaming, muscles burning, heart steady with grim focus. He didn't know her story yet. He didn't know the dog's name. He only knew that leaving them on the road would have been easier, and easier had never been the same as right. The cabin was smaller than it had looked from the road, a single-story structure crouched against the trees as if bracing itself for impact. The logs were dark with age, the chinking uneven, and the roof sagged slightly under the accumulating snow. Inside, the air carried the scent of wood smoke and old oil, the smell of a place lived in by necessity rather than choice. Mike Carter shut the door with his shoulder, locking out the wind, and for a moment the silence felt heavy, almost fragile. He set Sarah down first, easing her onto the narrow couch that doubled as his bed when his back flared up. Up close, she looked younger than she had in the stormlight, but more worn than her 33 years suggested. She was tall and lean, built for endurance, not softness, her limbs long and efficient even now as they trembled uncontrollably. Her dark hair had dried stiff where blood had frozen it, and her skin, olive-toned beneath grime and bruising, was cold to the touch. There was a faint scar along her jaw, pale and old, hinting at past violence that had left its mark without breaking her. Even unconscious, her brow furrowed, as if she were still working through a problem she refused to abandon. Mike moved with deliberate care, stripping off her soaked coat and wrapping her in the thickest blankets he owned. He did not rush. He knew better than to shock a body already failing. Hypothermia didn't announce itself with drama. It crept in quietly, stealing heat and judgment alike. He fed the wood stove until it glowed dull red, then positioned her close enough to feel warmth without risking burns. Only then did he turn to the dog. Duke lay where Mike had placed him near the hearth, his large frame curled protectively despite the pain that rippled through him. The German shepherd's coat was dense and coarse beneath Mike's hands, black along the spine and shoulders, tan at the legs and muzzle. His ears twitched at every sound, though his eyes drifted shut between shallow breaths. At 6 years old, Duke carried the look of a working animal who had spent most of his life paying attention, muscles still defined, posture ingrained with discipline. The gray at his muzzle spoke of time, not weakness. The wound along Duke's flank was ugly but clean-edged, likely torn by metal rather than shrapnel. Mike cleaned it slowly with boiled water, his jaw tight with concentration. He had stitched worse injuries on himself in places far less forgiving than this cabin, but it had been a long time, and his hands shook just enough to remind him he wasn't who he used to be. He wrapped the dog's leg as best he could, careful not to cut circulation, then layered blankets over him to trap heat. What made Mike pause wasn't the blood or the severity of the injuries. It was the dog's eyes. Each time Duke surfaced from pain, he turned his head toward the couch, checking on the woman. Even when it clearly hurt him to move, he insisted on knowing where she was. "You don't have to do that," Mike murmured, more gently than he spoke to most people. "She's still here." Duke's tail thumped once, weak but intentional, before his eyes closed again. The night stretched on in fragments. Mike moved between stove, couch, and hearth, checking skin temperature, breathing, color. He forced Sarah to sip warm water when she could swallow, counted Duke's breaths when they went too shallow, and talked quietly to fill the space when the silence pressed too close. He did not call for help. Not yet. Something about the way Sarah's body remained coiled even in unconsciousness, the way Duke reacted to every sound beyond the walls, told him that outside help might not be help at all. Near dawn, Sarah stirred. Her eyes opened abruptly, snapping into focus as if she had been trained to wake inside danger. Pain registered next, pulling a sharp inhale from her chest. She tried to sit up and failed, frustration flaring briefly across her face. "Easy," Mike said, stepping into her line of sight. "You're safe, for now." She studied him with quick, efficient movements of her eyes, cataloging height, build, posture. Mike was tall but carried his weight evenly, broad through the shoulders, his movements economical rather than imposing. His face was angular, weathered by cold and time, with a square jaw shadowed by salt and pepper stubble. His eyes were pale blue, steady, not prying. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse but controlled. "My place," Mike replied. "Name's Mike." She nodded once, accepting the answer without relief or fear. "Sarah," she said. "Thank you." Her gaze shifted to the hearth, to the dog lying there. The tension in her shoulders eased just slightly when she saw Duke breathing. "He's alive," Mike said, anticipating the question. Sarah exhaled, the sound shaky despite her composure. "He shouldn't have moved me," she said quietly. "I told him not to." Mike almost smiled. "Doesn't seem like the type to listen." A faint curve touched her mouth before pain wiped it away. They didn't talk much after that. Sarah drifted in and out, feverish but stable. Duke slept more deeply now, exhaustion overtaking vigilance. Mike brewed coffee strong enough to anchor himself, then stepped outside as the first gray light filtered through the trees. That was when he saw it. Near the edge of the porch, half hidden by fresh snow, was a small black disc, no larger than a coin, fixed crudely to the wooden beam. A tracking device, cheap and unrefined, the kind sold in bulk and used by people who valued speed over precision. Mike crouched, examining it without touching. It didn't take expertise to understand what it meant. Someone had wanted to know where the SUV ended up. Mike straightened slowly, the weight of the night settling into something heavier than fatigue. He thought of the road behind him, already erased by snow, and of the choice he had made without fully understanding its cost. Inside, the stove crackled. Sarah breathed. Duke slept. Mike reached up and disabled the device with a screwdriver, dropping it into a tin on the porch. He didn't throw it away. Evidence mattered now. When he stepped back inside, Sarah was awake again, watching him. "They'll come," she said, not as a warning, but a fact. Mike nodded. Yeah. He looked at the cabin, at the thin walls, the worn floor, the poor place that had somehow kept life through the night, and felt a familiar calm settle over him. He had tried for years to live quietly, to be invisible. That illusion had ended the moment he stopped on the road. "They're not going to find you alone," he said. And for the first time since the storm began, Sarah let herself believe it. Morning arrived quietly, as if the storm had exhausted itself. Arguing with the mountains. Pale light filtered through frost-clouded windows, settling into the cabin without warmth. Mike Carter had been awake for hours, sitting at the small kitchen table with a mug of reheated coffee cooling between his hands. He watched the steam thin and disappear, thinking about how often things vanished without ceremony. Outside, the world looked clean again, but he knew better now. Snow hid more than it healed. Sarah Mitchell woke slowly this time. There was no sharp gasp, no reflexive scan of corners, just a long breath, unsteady but deliberate, as if she were testing whether her body still belonged to her. Pain followed, settling into her ribs and shoulder with a dull insistence. She didn't cry out. She rarely did. Years of training and necessity had taught her that pain was information, not permission to stop. She was tall for a woman, around 5'9", her build lean and functional, the kind shaped by running restraint drills and too many nights sleeping lightly. Her dark brown hair, now loosely braided by Mike's clumsy hands, framed a face that would have seemed softer without the bruising along her cheekbone and the faint scar at her hairline. Her skin, olive-toned, still carried a grayish cast from blood loss and cold, but warmth was slowly returning. Her eyes, deep brown, steady, found Mike at the table. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, voice low and rough. "I didn't mean to pull you into this." Mike didn't answer right away. He waited until she finished speaking, the way he always did, letting silence do its work. "You didn't," he said finally. "I stepped in." That seemed to surprise her. She shifted carefully, wincing, then let her head rest back against the cushion. "Still," she said, "you and your dog, this wasn't your fight." Duke lifted his head at the sound of her voice. He lay on a thick rug near the stove, bandaged and immobile except for the slow wag of his tail when he saw she was awake. Up close in daylight, the German shepherd looked older than he had the night before. His fur had dulled with dried blood and antiseptic, and his injured leg was wrapped stiffly, limiting movement. At 6 years old, Duke had the bearing of a dog who had spent most of his life working. Broad chest, powerful shoulders, eyes that missed little. Now those eyes softened when they met Sarah's. "He doesn't think that way," Mike said. "Neither do I." Sarah swallowed, emotion flickering across her face before she tucked it away. "My name's Sarah Mitchell," she said. "I'm a federal investigator, DEA task force, mostly logistics and long-term surveillance, not the glamorous stuff." Mike nodded. He didn't offer his resume. She continued anyway, the words measured, controlled. I've been tracking a smuggling operation that uses winter routes, mountain passes, service roads, places people assume are closed. They move when weather erases evidence. I had proof, shipping schedules, storage points, enough to shut it down. Her jaw tightened. Someone leaked my position, not out here, higher up. That's why I didn't call for help after the crash. Mike understood that more than he wanted to. He had believed in systems once too, believed they protected their own. Belief like that left scars when it broke. They left the cabin late morning. Sarah insisted she could walk, though she leaned heavier on Mike than pride would have allowed under other circumstances. Duke moved slowly, stiff-legged, his body protesting every step, but he refused to be left behind. Mike fitted him with an old harness from the neighbor's discarded gear, turning it into a makeshift support. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The town lay 30 minutes down the mountain road, a small ski community built to look welcoming even when it wasn't. Wooden storefronts lined the main street, windows glowing with staged warmth. Mike parked near the pharmacy, careful not to draw attention. He pulled a knit cap low over his graying hair, his posture relaxed, the practiced invisibility of a working man who knew how to blend. Inside the store, the clerk barely looked up. Outside, Mike noticed the people who didn't fit. 2 men near the cafe entrance, standing instead of sitting, weight balanced forward. They wore clean winter jackets that hadn't seen work, their boots too new, their eyes too alert. Duke noticed them too. His ears flicked, body tensing just enough for Mike to feel it through the leash. "Easy," Mike murmured. Duke didn't bark. He stepped closer to Sarah instead, placing himself between her and the street. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but deliberate. They bought supplies and left without incident. Back at the cabin, Sarah pulled a slim waterproof drive from the inner pocket of her jacket. Mike set his old laptop on the table, one he'd kept disconnected from any network out of habit more than foresight. Sarah worked slowly, fingers steady despite the tremor in her arm. As files opened, patterns emerged. "The next shipment's due tonight or tomorrow morning," she said. "Through Blackstone Pass." Mike frowned. He knew the place. A narrow stretch of road cut between rock walls, one way in, one way out, no room for mistakes. "Hard to turn around," he said. "Exactly," Sarah replied. "They use it because no one expects traffic in weather like this." Mike leaned back, thinking. He wasn't planning an ambush. He wasn't thinking tactics. He was thinking about truth, about timing, about how some things only needed to be seen to fall apart. "We don't have to stop them," he said slowly. "Not ourselves." Sarah looked at him. "Then what?" "We make sure the right people see it," Mike said. "At the right moment." Duke rested his head on Sarah's knee, eyes half-lidded but aware. She placed a hand on his neck, grounding herself in the warmth still there. Outside, the light shifted as clouds thickened again. The storm wasn't finished. Neither were they. Night did not fall so much as it pressed in, slow and deliberate, sealing the cabin into a pocket of darkness surrounded by snow and trees. The storm returned in quieter form, not the violent whiteout of before, but a steady, patient snowfall that muted sound and shortened distance. Mike Carter moved through the cabin without turning on the overhead light, relying instead on the low glow of the wood stove and a single lamp shaded with yellowed cloth. Shadows stretched and softened, familiar shapes losing their edges. Sarah sat at the small table, wrapped in layers, her injured arm supported against her torso. In the lamplight, she looked more human and more fragile than she had all day. Her dark hair, braided loosely, had begun to slip free, strands catching the light where they framed her face. The bruising along her cheekbone had deepened to a mottled purple, standing out against her olive skin. She was still tall, even seated, her posture disciplined, but exhaustion bent her shoulders forward, the weight of the last 24 hours finally pressing through adrenaline. She watched Mike with careful attention, not suspicion, but trust built from shared silence rather than words. Duke lay near the hearth, his large body stretched awkwardly, bandaged leg elevated on folded blankets. His breathing was steadier now, but shallow. each rise of his chest measured. At 6 years old, the German Shepherd carried himself with the quiet dignity of an animal who understood responsibility. Even injured, his ears flicked at every sound outside the walls, tracking the rhythm of the night. Mike checked the locks again, slow and methodical. He had dragged an old dresser against the back door, not as a barricade, but as noise. If it moved, he would hear it. He scattered a handful of empty cans along the porch steps, a crude alarm, but effective. Years ago, in another life, he had learned that warning mattered more than strength. Now, he relied on that lesson. He killed the last lamp, leaving only the stove's dull glow. The cabin settled into near darkness. They heard footsteps just after midnight, not close at first, distant, measured, the sound of boots compressing snow with care rather than haste. Mike froze where he stood, hand lifting slightly to signal Sarah without turning his head. She caught the movement instantly, eyes narrowing, breath held. Duke's head rose a fraction, muscles tensing despite pain. The footsteps circled the clearing, never quite committing to a direction. Whoever it was moved with intention, testing space, listening. Mike felt his pulse slow rather than spike, the strange calm that came when fear had somewhere to go. He eased toward the front window and peered through a narrow gap in the curtain. Outside, darkness swallowed most detail, but a shape passed briefly between trees, tall and narrow, shoulders squared. The man, if it was a man, did not rush. That alone told Mike enough. This was not a desperate thief or a lost hiker. This was someone patient. Mike did not reach for a weapon. He reached for the switch controlling the exterior floodlight, his thumb resting there, waiting. He moved back toward the center of the room, placing himself between Sarah and the doors. Sarah shifted slightly, angling her body so she could see Mike's face. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Minutes stretched. The footsteps faded, then returned closer. Snow crunched near the side of the cabin. Duke struggled to his feet. The effort was painful and obvious. His injured leg barely held, muscles shaking as he rose. Mike whispered his name without sound, willing him to stay down. Duke ignored him. He did not lunge or bark. He limped to the narrow space near the back wall and stood there, broad chest facing outward, silhouette just visible through the thin glass of the rear window. Outside, a shadow paused. Duke did not growl. He simply held his ground, ears forward, presence unmistakable. In that stillness, something shifted. The shadow moved again, closer to the back corner. Mike flipped the switch. The floodlight snapped on, flooding the clearing with harsh white light. At the same moment, Mike shoved the dresser hard enough to scrape wood against wood and shouted into the night, his voice rough and loud, breaking the careful quiet. "That's close enough!" The figure outside jerked back, hand rising instinctively to shield their eyes. For a heartbeat, Mike saw him clearly. A man in his late 30s or early 40s, lean build, short dark beard framing a narrow jaw. His jacket was practical, worn but clean, the kind chosen by someone who expected to move through bad weather. His eyes, caught in the glare, were sharp and calculating rather than startled. The man did not speak. He took one step back, then another, retreating into shadow with controlled speed. The light revealed nothing else, no vehicle, no companions, but absence could be deceiving. Mike kept shouting for several seconds after the man disappeared, letting his voice carry farther than it needed to, selling the idea that he was not alone, that attention would be drawn if this continued. Only when the silence settled again did he cut the light. The aftermath hit fast. Duke collapsed where he stood, strength spent. His body hit the floor with a heavy thump that echoed in the quiet cabin. Sarah gasped despite herself, starting to rise before pain stopped her. Mike was there instantly, kneeling in the dim glow, hands gentle but urgent as he checked Duke's breathing. "It's okay," Mike said, voice breaking through his own control. "You're done. You did enough." Duke's eyes fluttered open briefly. His tail gave a faint movement against the floor, then stilled as exhaustion pulled him under. Mike rested his forehead against the dog's neck, breath fogging the air, the moment grounding him more than anything else could have. He stayed there longer than necessary, the cold seeping into his knees unnoticed. They didn't sleep much after that. Sarah remained awake, watching the windows, her mind racing despite her body's limits. Mike sat beside Duke until dawn hinted at the edges of the world, one hand resting on the dog's side, counting breaths. The footsteps did not return. When morning finally arrived, it did so quietly, pale light slipping between tree trunks, revealing a clearing untouched since the night before. No tracks crossed the snow near the porch. If someone had been there, the storm had erased them. The cabin stood. 3 lives inside it continued, and for Mike, that was enough victory for one night. Morning came thin and colorless, the kind of light that didn't promise warmth but did offer clarity. The storm had finally loosened its grip, leaving the mountains hushed and watchful. Mike Carter stood on the porch with a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, breath fogging the air as he looked toward the ridgeline where Blackstone Pass cut through rock and snow. The night had taken something out of him, sleep, certainty, the last of any illusions about staying untouched, but it had also left him with a quiet resolve he hadn't felt in years. Inside, Sarah Mitchell was awake and dressed as well as her injuries allowed. She moved carefully, tall and lean even now, her posture disciplined, hair pulled back into a practical braid that kept it off her face. The bruises along her cheekbone had yellowed at the edges, and the cut near her hairline was clean and bandaged. Her skin had regained some color, olive tones returning beneath the fatigue. She looked like someone who had learned to carry pain without letting it announce itself. When she spoke, it was measured and calm, the voice of a woman who understood that urgency could be an enemy. She had made contact just after dawn, stepping outside with Mike's old phone and a prepaid SIM she'd kept hidden for emergencies. The call was short and careful. The people she reached were not supervisors or administrators. They were peers, men and women who had worked with her long enough to know when to listen rather than question. They agreed to meet at Blackstone Pass. By mid-morning, Duke was awake again, though he did not try to stand. He lay on a padded blanket near the door, his large frame still, eyes alert. At 6 years old, the German Shepherd had the calm presence of an animal who had given much and understood the cost. His coat had been cleaned, the black and tan fur catching the light when he shifted. The bandages along his flank and leg were secure, and his breathing was steady. When Mike knelt beside him, Duke's tail moved once, slow and deliberate. "We'll be back," Mike told him, rubbing the thick fur behind his ears. "You rest." Duke didn't whine or resist. He watched them go with quiet trust. The drive to Blackstone Pass was uneventful, which made Mike uneasy. The road narrowed as it climbed, snow piled high against rock walls that pressed close on either side. There was no room to turn around, no place to hide. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, shoulders squared, eyes forward. She wore a borrowed winter coat that hung loose on her frame, but her presence filled the space easily. She wasn't afraid of what waited ahead. She was focused. They arrived early and parked in a turnout just before the narrowest stretch. The pass itself curved ahead, disappearing between stone. The air was still, the silence heavy enough to feel intentional. Mike killed the engine and waited. The first vehicle appeared less than an hour later, a box truck moving cautiously, tires crunching on packed snow. It slowed when it reached the narrow point, hesitating as if uncertain. That hesitation was the opening Sarah had counted on. 3 more vehicles followed, spaced carefully. The last was an SUV, dark and unremarkable. It stopped just short of the curve. A man stepped out. He was in his late 40s, tall and spare, with a narrow face and neatly trimmed beard that framed sharp cheekbones. His winter coat was expensive, but understated, the kind chosen by someone who valued control over display. His movements were economical, confident without swagger. This was Grant, the coordinator Sarah had described, the one who didn't move product himself, but made sure it moved. His eyes swept the pass with practiced assessment, then narrowed. Another car pulled in behind the convoy, then another, unmarked but purposeful. Sarah stepped out of the truck slowly, careful of her balance. Mike stayed close but didn't crowd her. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly in the cold air. "It's over," she said. "You're boxed in." Grant's gaze flicked to the vehicles behind him, then back to Sarah. A brief smile touched his mouth, thin and humorless. "You don't have the authority for this." Sarah met his eyes. "I have evidence." She held up the drive, not dramatically, just enough to be seen. Behind Grant, doors opened. Men stepped out, hands visible, expressions tightening as realization spread. There was no shouting, no sudden violence, just the slow collapse of denial. One of the men, shorter, heavier, face flushed with cold and stress, took a step back as if considering flight. He stopped when he saw the road behind him filled with people who looked like they knew exactly why they were there. The confrontation lasted minutes, not hours. Paperwork and procedure replaced tension with inevitability. Grant's shoulders slumped as the truth settled in. He did not argue. He did not threaten. He looked tired. Mike watched from a distance, hands in his pockets, feeling strangely removed. This wasn't his world, and yet it had brushed up against his life all the same. He didn't feel triumph. He felt relief. They drove back to the cabin together, the road behind them no longer erased, but revealed. A veterinary truck waited in the clearing when they arrived, its sides marked with the logo of a small animal clinic from town. The veterinarian, a woman in her early 40s with wind-burned cheeks and practical boots, knelt beside Duke with practiced calm. Her hair was streaked with gray and pulled into a low ponytail, her hands steady as she examined the dog. "He's lucky," she said after a while. "Strong heart. But that leg, he's not going to run like he used to." Mike nodded. "That's okay." Duke was loaded gently onto a stretcher, eyes tracking Mike until the doors closed. Sarah stood beside him, her expression soft with something like gratitude and grief intertwined. They didn't stay long after that. Paperwork was signed, statements were given, promises were made without ceremony. When the clearing finally emptied, Mike stood alone on the porch, the cabin quiet around him. The stove had gone cold, the air smelled clean. Sarah came to stand beside him. "You could have driven past," she said. "Most people would have." Mike shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. Didn't feel like a choice. She nodded, understanding. "It rarely does." Weeks later, Duke came home. He moved slower now, gait uneven but determined, scars knitting into his coat like punctuation marks. He slept more. He watched the world with the same steady eyes. Mike adjusted his routines without complaint, working fewer night shifts, spending more time in the quiet that had once frightened him. On a clear morning, Mike opened the door and let the light in. Duke stepped onto the porch and sat, leaning his weight gently against Mike's leg. The mountains stood unchanged. Hope, Mike realized, didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with noise or applause. It stayed. Months later, life did not become easier. It became quieter. Mike still lived simply in the same small cabin with the same worn tools and early mornings. But the silence no longer felt empty. It felt shared. Sarah returned to her work, moving more carefully now, listening longer, choosing compassion over speed. She had learned that justice without humanity can wound as deeply as the crimes it tries to stop. Duke came home with scars that would never fully fade. His steps were slower, his body less willing, but his eyes were peaceful. He had done what he was meant to do. He had stayed. One pale morning, sunlight barely strong enough to melt the frost, Mike opened the door and breathed in the cold air. Duke sat on the porch, leaning his weight gently against Mike's leg, as if reminding him that he was not alone. Winter had not completely left the mountains, but something else had arrived. Some people call it coincidence, some call it luck, others call it timing. But those who have stood in the darkest cold when strength was gone and fear was loud often recognize it by another name. Grace. Grace is not always thunder from the sky. Sometimes it is a stranger who stops when it would be easier to drive on. Sometimes it is a loyal heart that refuses to let go. Sometimes it is help arriving quietly, exactly when it is needed most. In our daily lives, we face smaller storms, loneliness, exhaustion, doubt, injustice. And like Mike, like Sarah, like Duke, we are often tempted to believe we must survive them alone. But healing begins when no one is left behind. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe that even in the coldest seasons, grace still moves among us, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach those who need them most. May God bless you, protect those you love, and walk with you through every storm.